Hello everyone, and welcome to the Social Coast Forum of 2022. My name is Sarah Spiegler, and I am the Coastal Resilience Specialist for North Carolina Sea Grant, and I am located in Morehead City, North Carolina. I'm also joined today by Kayla Cawthorn, the Climate Resilient Extension Associate and my colleague at North Carolina Sea Grant. We're going to talk to you today about our research project called A Place-Based Process for Equitable Risk Communication. To start off, we wanted to give you all a sense of place for coastal North Carolina and what makes it an awesome place to live, work, and play. It has the second largest estuarine system in the United States and over 12,000 miles of estuarine shoreline and over 300 miles of ocean shoreline. This includes the Outer Banks, a world-renowned barrier island system that stretches more than 175 miles along the coast and provides protection for our sounds and estuaries. The extensive natural resources and diverse ecological systems here in North Carolina underpin the state's coastal economy and supports our growing coastal resident population. So, what are some of the issues that we are facing here in coastal North Carolina? We have some of the highest vulnerabilities to sea level rise on the Atlantic coast, and we have a high wave exposure, a low relief coastal slope, and barrier islands. Essentially, we are very low lying here in North Carolina. We are likely to experience between 2 and 4.5 feet of relative sea level rise by 2100. The highest local rates of sea level rise are expected along the northeast coast of North Carolina, where in some areas the rates are currently increasing at over 5 millimeters per year. Since 2016, North Carolina has also seen unprecedented damage from Hurricanes Matthew, Florence, and Dorian. NOAA estimated that Hurricane Florence caused $22 billion in damage to North Carolina in 2018. More intense storms, greater rainfall, rising seas, and then other non-climate stressors like growth and development, aging infrastructure, and social inequities will continue to raise the starting baseline for the impacts we are seeing to our communities and natural systems here in North Carolina. We also know that many communities that are most vulnerable to climate change impacts also have the least resources to address these challenges. Here at North Carolina Sea Grant, we work closely with coastal communities through research, education, and extension, and we often observe these challenges. At Sea Grant, we are working with our partners to improve practices to better communicate these impacts and learn how we can more fully and equitably engage communities that have historically been excluded from the conversation. This project that we're working on is a partnership between the NOAA National Water Initiative, the NOAA Office of Coastal Management, NOAA's Educational Partnership Program, and Sea Grant programs in Mississippi, Alabama, Hawaii, and North Carolina. The research is examining how to communicate risk related to the long-term chronic impacts of climate change, like sea level rise, coastal flooding, and storm surge, and it focuses on working with underserved and underrepresented communities. The first phase of the project was the completion of a literature review of risk communication best practices. Now in the second phase of the research, the 3 Sea Grant programs are working to ground truth the findings of the academic literature review. In the fall of 2020, Carla Lopez, who was a graduate student in the NOAA Educational Research and Training Opportunity Program, completed a comprehensive literature review of risk communication best practices. The literature review made 6 best practice recommendations to improve communication and engagement with underserved communities. The best practices aim to address past challenges, things such as communication historically being disconnected from place, or failing to equitably engage communities, or emphasizing community vulnerability over strengths and resilience. Now the 3 Sea Grant programs in Mississippi, Alabama, Hawaii, and North Carolina are using these recommendations from the literature review in a place-based process to engage both new and current partners and communities in discussions around sea level rise, flood hazards, and resilience. The lessons learned from this on-the-ground experience is helping to supplement the literature review, and the process has provided a better understanding of equitable and inclusive risk communication. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Kayla Cawthorn, and she's going to tell you about some of the early lessons that we've learned here in North Carolina and by the Sea Grant programs.
As Sarah mentioned, there are several lessons learned that we've identified to date that have been important to this process. The first is that words and language matter when describing and working with underserved communities. And it's vital to be aware of how we're labeling or defining communities as someone who isn't a member of that community, and to understand and be sensitive to how these types of labels or definitions could be received as we're navigating working on the ground with actual communities and not just sitting behind a computer. And we've also learned that the appropriate language and words to use is always changing, sometimes month to month or even week to week. And this means we can continue to learn and unlearn, take responsibility for our own education, and be open to receiving feedback. And there are also challenges to how we structure funding opportunities internally and the culture around the types of projects and organizations that are typically funded. The initial stages of long-term relationship and partnership building can be challenging to fund. And best practices remind us that it's important to build trust and relationships from the beginning and to compensate community partners and organizations for their participation. But meaningful compensation for a new community partner or community members can face roadblocks from a university funding structure and culture, often creating an immediate barrier to building trust. And we recognize that this may become a more common challenge as many organizations and researchers are striving to work with new and underserved communities, but often without the funding mechanisms to include them from the beginning and the appropriate language to describe why a particular community was selected. So it's really important to note here that getting this right matters when building long-term relationships, as many communities have deep distrust of government and outsider organizations, and we need to be careful to not do more harm than good going into a community without the sensitivity of being aware of how funding is structured and how to use it to drive community needs. So there are opportunities for research and extension professionals to think more creatively about compensation and in what forms to provide it. For example, through stipends, equipment, or direct grant money, and to go beyond traditional compensation measures like gift cards to ways that more meaningfully value community participation and meet the community's needs. Trusted messengers are critical in the communication process, and distinguishing if you can become a trusted messenger for a community or if it's more appropriate to work with the trusted messengers within a community is another important lesson learned here. So relationships, as we know, are built over the long term and not on grant cycles. So it's vital to be honest about your level of participation in communities where historical distrust is present, since research conducted on grant cycles does have the potential to leave communities with no follow-through once the grant's finished. So it's important that communication and extension professionals are also valued for this work, and for funders to realize that deadlines often have to be extended to account for the slow process of building trust with communities. And we've learned firsthand that sometimes trusted messengers and community champions leave for professional or personal reasons. So what happens with the trust that's been established, especially when that person wears many hats in the community? And what's the best way to continue that relationship? So we're still learning best ways to address this, but these could include opportunities like using memorandums of understanding or MOUs, engaging with regional groups that could help serve smaller communities where capacity is an issue, or building relationships with more than one person so that there's someone that can step in and continue that relationship in the event of a turnover. When building new relationships in underserved communities, it's okay to make mistakes, but be careful of causing more harm than good. Bringing something to the table and taking the lead on the labor of relationship building can be very helpful in alleviating the pressure that this can put on a new partner. And approaching new relationships from the place of, what does the community care about? How can you get involved? What are their needs and how can you add value? And making the effort to go where the community is can really go a long way. Underserved communities are also often working to address more pressing issues within their communities than chronic climate impacts. So how can we best find overlap between our projects and the community's priorities or interests, and be open to listening for how the community is caring about this issue? Because sometimes the language used at the community level to talk about this is different than what we have as a practitioner. There's also a lot of push right now to work with underserved communities by many agencies and organizations. And it's likely that some will do a good job and others may not. So community fatigue and even more distrust resulting from these recent efforts are challenges to be aware of that may make it even more difficult to build trust in some cases. So be flexible in learning about the community's needs, how you can step in, how you can volunteer your time, and how you can add value to something that they already have a framework for. And don't be too quick to push your needs and priorities in a new relationship, as this can take time to really get to and understand. And then finally, the pros and cons of pivoting to being primarily virtual with the COVID-19 pandemic. Virtual options have shown benefits of allowing for more accessibility, with people not having to overcome your more traditional barriers of attending a meeting in person, such as conflicting work schedules, not having reliable transportation, household and family responsibilities, etc. But they can also still present challenges similar to in-person, including community members who don't have adequate or reliable internet connection, aren't comfortable with virtual platforms, don't want to be on video because of privacy or other concerns, or have other issues that might impact accessibility. So some of these challenges can be addressed by having open and transparent conversations with stakeholders about what the best method of communication and engagement is for their community, and being aware that there may be a desire to please the organizer. So listen carefully to what the communication needs are, and don't be afraid to ask more than once. So to give you some context on our efforts here in North Carolina, we're working to apply these best practices in the Lower Cape Fear region and Down East communities, where we have historical relationships, but we're also engaging and working to build relationships with new community organizations and stakeholders. So we started by researching and investing time in getting to know the communities, their background and history, and identifying and engaging with community leaders and stakeholders, where we've emphasized our desire to take the time to build long-term relationships with our Sea Grant program that extend beyond this project. And most of the engagement has been virtual due to COVID-19, and we fully recognize the challenges inherent with this process, meeting in person when possible and with appropriate safety precautions. And through this, we've been listening for where there might be overlap between risk communication gaps and community priorities, and opportunities to integrate consideration of sea level rise, flood hazards, and resilience into the work the community's already doing. So in summary, we wanted to leave you with a few key takeaways that we've learned in this project that we think are helpful in the process of working with new communities and those who historically haven't been at the table. So communities across the coast are unique, but also have underlying similarities when it comes to how they're being impacted by climate change. And working with underserved communities is not such a different process. However, because of the history of distrust, trauma, and discrimination in many of these communities, adapting best practices and applying lessons learned becomes even more important. And this often means time, resources, and consistently educating yourself and your organization. And patience is really a virtue in this process. So be aware of not prioritizing your own needs, as it can take time to identify where there's that overlap in priorities. And then more specific to the pandemic, it's vital to be mindful of and sensitive to what people have been going through for the past couple of years, especially in underserved communities who have been disproportionately impacted. So while this was always important, staying flexible, compassionate, and empathetic, and being aware of in what way and how much of people's time and energy you're asking for can really help to accommodate people who might be struggling. So these are just a few of many challenges to be aware of. And as we work with stakeholders on the ground, we'll continue to learn and share as we move forward in this process. And with that, that concludes the presentation we have for you all today. So thank you so much for tuning in as part of Social Coast 2022. And contact information for both Sarah and myself are on the slide. So please feel free to reach out anytime.